Hello and welcome back to Voicecraft, a medium for artful and experimental conversations that seek to share insight into the nature of psyche, culture, and our relationship to an evolving world at the turn of an age. It's part of a broader culture-making vision to build wiser pathways to connection and collaboration and more effective protocols for sense-making and generative, meaningful, and healthy interaction. There are breadcrumbs to follow if you look. I think part of what I heard there was this relationship between the wisdom of crowds and also the madness of crowds. And I think what's most important is the capacity to discern in whatever the case is, in fact, the wisdom. And there's something else that's really coming through to me here when we speak about vision and fabric, and it's the notion of religion. It's a notion of something we can all gather around in some sense, even if we want to understand that center as a wandering center, as a moving center to continually be re-realized and rewoven. Still some inner orientation towards something that together we can share in. And that there's a bidirectionality to that. There's both the classic conservatism and progressive thing, to put it in sort of more topical language, but a deep care for the lineage and the vitality of where one's been, where we've been together, and what we're caring about now. And then also what it is we have to adapt to, and the sort of the valley to cross and the land beyond. So how do we reorient such a broad thing in this time? I just wonder, I have a lot to say about this, but I'm wondering where the notion of religion and plays into this feeling, this sense of this. So Erick, when you're mentioning how that the rebel is just as trapped, it's like there's a sense in which someone who's just taking the contrary position isn't yet able to really participate in the generative thing together. There's still a kind of lock there, right? They might not have a belief maybe that it is actually possible to really step into a deep not knowingness, but actually somehow be caught in a kind of process, to be held in a kind of process, or at least go there together. I'm not saying it always has to be like a nice, soft, holdy, pleasurable thing at all, but that we can actually go, hang on a second, like step the fuck back. Shit is fucked, hey? Shit is fucked. Like when that point comes when it's like, no, actually we've forgotten some extremely important things. You begin to put the like step forward a little bit to confront, hey, and go, have we really forgotten something? Can we go somewhere together? All these kind of these energies that I've infused in this little dynamic here. I'm interested in what religion is like, how you hold the concept of religion and it's important in this time.
Yeah. So, okay. What comes up for me when I hear the word religion is that, at least how it functions in my mind and how I see it function in most people's mind, is that, and Jung has a great quote that I don't remember exactly, but religion is the barrier that keeps people from experiencing God. And the way that I understand that is religion, as it's used, is a set of principles or behaviors that you ought to do to be a part or to connect to whatever this version of divinity is that's been taught to you. Something about the death of God, as pronounced by Nietzsche, ushered in this incredible and probably terrible responsibility that it feels like, and this is what my life has felt like, and I'm sure it's going to resonate for both of you, is that we now live in a time where we have to create our own religion, like personal religion within each of us. And really on some level, I think that that's your personal philosophy, and that the only way to create your religion is you have to learn how to be quote unquote spiritual. But what I feel that means is, can you learn how to feel into what is trying to come out of you, and then you enact it in the world as an experiment, and then anything that improves the world around you, hold that as a principle for the time being, and then continue to act out the principles that arise through you be humble enough to put down the ones that don't improve your life in the way that you feel called to improve it. And then you slowly start to build up a set of, you know, hypotheses for how to be as a being in the world to make it a better place. And then your being becomes the testament of whatever your personal religion is. And then the way admiration functions in people is that it's not a conscious choice. You don't get to choose who you admire. It's something that comes through you. And so then if people start to admire the principles that you're enacting in the world, you can use that as more feedback. And that it feels like religion is the stultified version of spirituality, and that we live in a time where no cement structure is going to be the thing that gets us to tomorrow, and that people have to learn how to bring forward their personal spirituality. And then we have to fucking communicate. We have to share what we believe these ideas are. We have to be willing to be seen. We have to be willing to be critiqued. We have to be willing to transform. And my intuition is that there's a collectiveness that's happening through the rise in connective technology, where there is an unnamed yet religion arising that will never be called a religion, because the moment you call it a religion, you try to put a box around God. But it feels like there's a new spirituality that's arising that I hope continues to argue with each other in a way where it continues to adapt and evolve. And that I think that religion in some sense is dead forever through that interpretation of religion.
Mm-hmm.
I think religion's still got some juice in it yet. But I also think that when we talk about religion, I mean, we're falling into a certain kind of particularly very Western language game.
Yeah.
And, you know, religion, the concept of religion as like a Dewey Decimal category of things in the world is, I think, very tied up with the concept of church orthodoxy in this very specific way, right? And, you know, church orthodoxy obviously didn't stop Gnostics and Cathars and Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox and right and any number of other split-off groups, and then eventually Protestantism, which really blew the cap off. But the idea of a sort of like a large centralized authority on doctrine is in some sense very Western, right? When, you know, religious studies scholars and anthropologists, you know, went into other cultures, you know, we went in to India and we said, you know, Hinduism, Buddhism, but what we were really describing was like a huge variety of local practices and local deities, and it was diverse in a sense as, you know, languages, right? Language diversity in an area. And so you get these expressions which obviously share a certain amount of underlying, you know, shared material because the humans are in proximity. But the idea of trying to be like Hinduism, it's not a thing in the same way, right? There's a diversity of expression and a diversity. And I think that in the same way as Latin, right, bound the West and the church bound the West, religion is similarly, it's a kind of yoking, right? It binds to cultural consciousness in a certain way. Now, on one hand, yeah, I think that has probably had, at least in its current formulation, sort of its heyday. As this goes forward, people are going to be playing a much more syncretic and a much more a little of this and a little of that, like, you know, going to a nice market kind of approach. But I guess I think about it in two ways. One, those old rituals, you know, the old rituals, the old liturgies, the old formulations of myth often have a surprising amount of power left in them.
Right.
Provided you can connect. And, you know, it's a little bit like when you're talking in magical terms, you know, in the 70s, there was a big rise in chaos magic. And chaos magic had this very like idiosyncratic, do-it-yourself, individualize your myth kind of thing. Hit in the 70s, maybe peaked in the 90s, somewhat declined, right? And it's a cool idea that you can, you know, do a magical ritual and summon, you know, James Bond for confidence, and that fundamentally what you're dealing with in any event is sort of a narrative entity, right? however you want to put the metaphysics on there.
Right.
But there is something to be said for the old stuff. Like it's the blood runs deep. You have to really drill, in a sense. You have to like concentrate to get in. But when you connect, you're connecting with something that has the rhythm and the routine of generations and generations of humans, and has influenced the culture code in all of these ways, right? Which is why, as much as people talk about it, I just don't think Christianity, for instance, is down for the count. Right. I think it's due for a massive transformation that's probably 1,500 years overdue or so. But, but like that the fundamentals there, and some of the fundamental, I mean, I was raised like half Catholic. So my mom's Catholic, Catholic heretic, and my dad is nominally Anglican, but he's actually he's a kind of a pothead science fiction fan. So, and those two streams, come together. And so, I was the questioning, skeptical kid in my grade school. Like I got tossed out of religion class on the regular. Yep. But when I reconnected to that stuff at about 20, and, I wrote a novel about Christ. I started reading the Gospels in as close to the original formulations as possible. I did a lot of, general scholarship about Jesus, and I listened to Jesus Christ Superstar, the film version soundtrack, nonstop for like, I don't know, months. Wow. And the effect that had, right, really just like soaked in. Like I got this tremendous respect for some of those myths and things that I had taken for granted as being just like down for the count, right? I was like, no, it's not. Like there is a vital current here, but it needs something. And I guess the way that I think about it is that, when we talk about sort of spirituality or religion, when we talk about that binding function of religion, what we're talking about is authority, right? It's authority, and both like in the sense of like, epistemological authority, but also political authority and authority. And I think that the way forward, and obviously this ties into my own work, is that we need to invest that sense of authority and thus the kind of the unity that can bind together our experiences in something else. And I mean, my pitch is obviously science, that science needs to be playing an integral role in this. And that to the extent that science stops ignoring this shit, and it finally is, to be fair. And honestly, you can go back pretty far, right? Scientists in previous centuries had no problems thinking about this stuff. And, William James, right, is a huge pioneer of religious studies, but also of psychology, at large. And I think returning to that Jamesian mold, not necessarily a perennialism of trying to like just everything boils down into the same thing, but instead looking at this stuff scientifically and realizing that our shared inheritance as human beings massively outweighs the differences, which doesn't invalidate the differences. They're important, but it gives us a framework. And to the extent that we study it, we can understand, like, what is it that matters to us in religion? Well, what matters is awe and the sense of the sacred, and the sense of transcendence, and the production of meaning, and the ability of stories to reflect back and enrich and inform. And these are things that we can look at out of any specific religious context, and thus enable that kind of thing where we can be doing personal exploration, but there's something that we can refer back to. There's some pole star to guide by. It's the second time the pole star came up. Anyway, I don't know what that means.
I completely agree. And the thing that resonates the most with me is that it really feels like the call of this time is to help science learn how to bridge to the meaning and the value truths inside of religion. And instead of seeking to destroy religion, seeking to integrate religion without the orthodoxy, without the political authority, and because the most convincing language of modern people now is science, or what people think is science, and there's all sorts of ways that it can be manipulated and such, or at least to the conscious mind. And that if science can find a bridge to religion and to excavate the gold and the living essence that's still there, I feel is one of the most important tasks.
Hmm.
Yeah. Science, I think, done right, and science is often done poorly.
Yes.
But of course, science done right, anytime people get bent out of shape, it's like, but they just found a new thing that contradicted the old thing. It's like, good, then they're doing their job.
Exactly.
That's what they're supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be churning, folks, because the whole point is that it's a constant unfolding. It's a constant. We're not going to get to the end. No. Science, contra what some people think, doesn't have a terminus. It's not. I don't think anyway. I mean, I could be wrong, I suppose, but I think it's just like we're just going to continue to move into the twilight horizon. And
like the intuition is that whatever this thing is infinite. Like
yeah.
whatever you want to call it it's infinite. And so of course there is no end point in the understanding of infinity.
Right. And it's going to revolutionize as it goes, right? As our sense of scale and our sense of whatever, and the depth of our dynamics, and is going to just keep turning over. And one thing to bring us back around, science in a sense often runs opposite conventional dogmatic narrative because it does two things. It has built into it this process of self-revolution, right? Very, very much so, in a way that theology or something might resist fairly strenuously. But the other, of course, is that it deeply weirds things. So people often talk about science disenchanting the world, and I just think that couldn't be further from the truth.
Agreed.
Common sense takes the sort of unfamiliar and explains it in terms of the familiar. But science takes the familiar and then explains it in terms of the unfamiliar.
Yeah.
It makes everything much weirder, weirder. And so that, right, now whether or not culture at large can handle that as a central ethos is not clear, right? Because that's in some ways a minority position that's hard for people to come to. It challenges their sense of stability and all kinds of stuff, and it pisses them off. But I think if we could get that going, and then maybe connect it up, I think, with something else you said, which is the in some sense the democratization, or at the very least the egalitarian distribution of enactive myth making.
Right.
So that we're not being given myths in the same way, but we're producing them. Right. And that's, of course, one of the reasons I'm so big on role-playing again, is I sometimes see it as this kind of historical emergence. There was really nothing like it 60 years ago. And 50 years ago, it comes on the scene, and it sort of emerges from wargaming innocuously. But then since then, the basic concepts and stuff have been making these steady, secret invasion kind of inroads into the culture that have massively altered the way that we think about games, the way that we think about stories, right? Mass media, I don't think you could have Game of Thrones in some sense without having that kind of gaming. And, a direction people often go on it is they're like, well, what role-playing games do is, of course, they prefigure virtual reality. But, and maybe they do. Certainly the language is going to end up borrowed the same way as it was for video games, right? Millions, billions of people play Pokemon and have no idea that levels and HP and all of that stuff that's just D&D code. But I think even more interesting is like the way that, especially in the current explosion, what it does is it passes these tools for like small group, idiosyncratic myth making and value production and dramatic storytelling in what is in many ways the oldest art form, right? Verbal storytelling and a certain amount of animated pictures, right? It brings us back to the campfire with, some rules and some dice, because we're grown up and we want to, deflect arguments.
I'm getting goosebumps, yeah.
Right? But if we can sort of do that and link it up with psychotechnologies, right? If we can go into, the shattered cathedrals, as it were, and take the stained glass windows out of them and bring them into the light, and hook them up to something that's self-regenerating and sort of weirding like science, that I think is the sort of engine that might actually get us through the narrow gate that faces us. And I'm an optimist too, to be fair. I'm just an optimist that sweats heavily every time I read the news.
I fucking love the idea, and I got goosebumps when you articulated that there is something almost implicitly in subversive about role playing, in the sense that it allows people to learn how to generate their own myths and then to embody those own myths inside of a game. And game is one of the oldest like structures that the conscious mind has created to help guide action. And I know for me personally, like I was raised on role-playing games, not television. You know, like I grew up in a family where everyone else was watching TV, but I was playing Final Fantasy for 50 or 100 hours. And I was learning about mythological creatures. I was learning about gods. I was learning about what it means to be heroic. And like my path compared to everyone that I grew up with is so fundamentally different. And it feels like a huge part of that is because I played role-playing games.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is, and this sometimes surprises me when I consider, but all that's in its infancy.
Yeah.
Like, especially tabletop video games, of course, have inherited a lot of it, and they've become massively more sophisticated. But even tabletop's only 50 years old. 50 years. There are a few things that are like, you know, go back a little further if you sort of dig around in the historical record. But like, it's a more recent technology than radio. And so, like, you know, a significantly more recent technology. It's more recent than television.
Yeah.
And yet it's a thing that it's almost shocking it never existed. I mean, you could have had it in the Roman Empire. They had all the bits. It's just that it didn't emerge. And I think there's something that I often speculate is there, which is that when you have a culturally unified ethos of storytelling, be it religion or general mythology and stuff, there's already that structure. And like, it's mostly, not that it was never used as propaganda, it was, but that being within that structure sort of met those needs. And so people, if you were a bard or something, maybe you would ad lib and embellish and tell stories and add stuff. And in the oral traditions, that's often the case. But for everybody else, they were just on the receiving end. And I think what we're really starting to see is that participatory aspect, which takes us back into ritual. Participatory drama is ritual. It's putting on a role. It's draping yourself in the animal skin hood, and then taking on the form of the animal. And, you know, as somebody who runs games, right? As somebody who runs games, one of the things that I like to point out to people is I play all the bad guys. This is just shadow workout like you can't get in therapy, man, because I can just be an absolute bastard, and that's what they want. That's what everybody wants. You want a good antagonist, no good villain, no good story in a basic story. And so I get to be absolutely like a grind, and yet I can put it into the space where everybody gets a cathartic payoff, where I don't have to take my monstrousness and excessively embody it in the world, right? But instead, I get to like move into these spaces that might otherwise be, quite frankly, kind of terrifying to inhabit in other contexts, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I could go on about this stuff all day, but
so the thing that really resonated with me is that it's this idea that like if psyche is like the ocean, you cannot concretize over it. It will always burst through, and that when organized religion really lost the function that it serves in the psyche, when it kind of disintegrated in the last 100 years, it had to come out through some other way. And one of the ways that it's erupted back through is through role playing. I recently read a book called We by Robert Johnson. Are you familiar with it?
I am, yeah. It's a whole he, she, we.
Yes.
There's like a sequence of them, yeah.
Right. And the idea of we is he articulated that one of the other places where the function that religion sought to meet erupted back through when the container was kind of destroyed is through romantic love. And that it's the projection of the divine onto the partner that then allows you to work through, all of the aspects that we sought to have met through religion. And so these feel like two prime examples in our lifetime where, like Jung talked about, you can destroy the container, but the archetype will just go underground. you know, and that these seem to be two of the big primary ways that whatever it is that the psyche seems to need in order for it to be healthy, it's finding new containers. And two of them are the projection of the, you know, inner God onto the romantic partner, and then also role playing. And the other thing that you shared is the catharsis that can come through role playing of working out your shadow. It's exactly the same type of articulation that I hear from people that consciously explore BDSM. Like what I find,
right, which is structured into scenes and also has dungeon masters.
Exactly. Right. Yes. And that what I find is people who have complex PTSD, they actually seem to be the ones who gravitate towards BDSM when it's done consciously and intentionally. It actually allows them to like almost replay the scenes that their inner child would had to have played out in order to, you know, not be traumatized. And it feels like I love that you just connected scenes and dungeon masters, and it's the exact, like, to me, all of this is more evidence that the psyche is so powerful at seeking whatever it can find in its environment to heal and to grow, in the same way that wherever you plant that motherfucking seed, it is going to use every possible resource in its environment to grow.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about working with the unconscious, I think that's wonderful, but also sometimes frustrating, right, is that it exceeds our conscious scope by such a huge factor, right? That it's like when, you know, people really want a sense of finality, it's, right? They want to be able to go through a process and finish it. It's like, no, you don't understand. Like you're never done. You're never done. Because you can't be, because it's impossible, because it's so much bigger than you, right? And by the same token, I think, you know, the fact is that it's thus more adaptable than we are and more mercurial than we are. It can always find another way in. It's smarter than we are in some sense, right? It doesn't matter what bullshit constructions we end up putting up, it can figure out a way around. And my experience with complexes especially, I mean, even if they're kind of screwing with you, they're very clever about it, right? They can do these really clever, you know, workarounds. Romantic love is an interesting one. I have to admit, that's actually something that worries me a bit when I consider it. I remember Johnson's point in We, and I sometimes worry that, you know, after we sort of shoved God off the throne, that looking for a sort of a pivot point for the universe, we enthroned romantic love, right?
Right, and that it's not the right move.
It's the problem with it is that trying to make another human being the pivot point of the universe is unfair to them and unfair to yourself. Yep. And like you see it with projections all the time, right? 100%. Where, you know, one member of the couple is like, oh my God, they're perfect. They're perfect in every way. And the other member of the couple is probably saying something more like, they're not perfect, but I'll change those things. And both of them are disappointed. One wears through the illusion and it's like, what? You're a human? This is not what I signed up for. I signed up for a divine being. And the other one is like, I have failed to transform you into my particular divine being that I had in mind. Yes. And everybody walks away pissed off that they didn't end up with a perfect lover of limitless erotic capacity, an absolute best friend, a, you know, business partner, a replacement for, you know, the all meaning. So I worry about that sometimes. And a lot of that is about the erosion of friendship. You know, people localize themselves in one relationship because families are more atomized. Friendship is not, you know, like I was remarking to my partner actually the other day. I was like, there are couples therapists. Why are there no friends therapists?
Yeah.
I don't know is the answer.
What you just said rocks me, because I find that one of my complexes is I try to make my romantic partner also my best friend, and that puts too much pressure on them, and that feels like that's something that like we've evolved to be in a tribe, you know, and to disperse that weight amongst many.
This has been a really beautiful train, progression, dialogue here that I've really enjoyed witnessing. An image did come to me though. I feel like I'm watching a beautiful ship, and I just took a jump in the ocean, and I'm trying to catch up back with the ship now. And I've got like, hey guys, I've got like a couple planks here. You know, I feel like I want to add them onto the ship, because so there's a couple interesting themes coming through. So you've mentioned the importance of science, the importance of participatory myth making. Put that into a slightly different category, like the playing it out in a way that is evocative or enabling of growth together. And we've also spoken about the importance, or we've sort of spoken about the fragmentation and the breakdown of religious structures, where previously there had been a congregation, and before then we've got these notions of tribe. And we've just moved on to speaking about how it's sort of inappropriate to sort of conduit what was this multi-nodal network that one was a part of through like one specific point, like one specific person, too much of a pivot. And I'm feeling like there's actually a lot, obviously, to save here in religion. And I can appreciate the point about words becoming unworkable in some important sense. And something that was coming to me, I think, that might thematically bring a lot of this together is the idea that's spoken about quite a bit, which is that, you know, the church is not the building, it's the people who have the capacity to build churches. And concrete churches is actually really helpful to get through the night, to get to the next day. It's just that we want to not mistake the church for the actual thing. It's our capacity to religion as reconnect together to, in an ongoing sense, realize what the kind of wandering structure enabling of our ongoing adaptivity and protection from that which would sort of pull us apart, or too much entropy, or what have you, so that we can go out and face another day, that we can rejuvenate, you know, this idea of a kind of a integration as metabolizing in good company was something that came to me the other day that I quite liked, and was something I so realized I was seeking after some particular sort of energetic expenditure, just to hang out with friends and eat some food, which is something difficult for me at the moment because we're under curfew here. Or in fact, we're not now, as of a couple of days ago, but we were for like 10 weeks or so in Melbourne, which has been quite a trip. Something else was this this frustration with religion as too much of a concrete authority, but that if we can shift this to some sort of more flexible religion as ennobling and enabling of our authorship over our connectedness together on an ongoing basis, that this is kind of helpful. But I wonder about, you know, as part of me that wants to actually dig in a little bit to what we mean by science, because I'm seeing science here as in fact not the container within which everything else is sitting. And in fact that the curious spirit of the scientific approach to the world, to continually sort of disconfirm what one previously thought to be the case and continue to move towards some sort of more real pattern in that sense, is itself, the will for that, we can just as well say, is more lit by something, you know, inflamed by something that we can refer to in a more metaphysical sense, which is something that, at least in my sort of coherence making of my own process, is something that plays a very sort of important role there. And it kind of partly comes up in this notion of psyche that we've presenced just towards the end here, is that it will find a way, you know, it will find a way in whatever the context is to make itself, to realize itself. And so what I'm hearing, and please, like, maybe this is not so, I'm hoping this kind of synthesizes in a helpful way. What I'm hearing is that something of what we mean by science, the methodology of observation and, you know, better epistemics in that kind of sense, can help us understand what are the most effective ways of creating game-like structures, enabling of participating in the emerging context of our time, so that we can in fact let what in us is sort of transcendentally available to reconnect with each other in this way of friendship, fellowship, and in some sense sort of this capacity we have to extend the hand with each other, and in the face of finitude and the looming void, we can be together and transcend it and accept it and enjoy ourselves along the way. I'm finding science, rather than being the fundamental thing within that can situate all of this, is in fact, like, in some sense, it's like of the essence of tool, of the essence of technology that we must wield appropriately, but that cannot, in some sense, we should not see it as something that can explain our nature, which is why I think this Jungian type approach, just from this angle, and a metaphysical one as well, can help, I think, provide a more rounded, integrous notion of what it is to be fundamentally, and as we're here. How is this as a sort of framing?
Yeah, I mean, science at the end of the day, the experimental method and whatever, it's one more psychotechnology, right? It's one more tool in the kit. It's a tool that does certain particularly good things. It's good at generating sort of certain kinds of communal questions. It's very good at taking small things and refining them to the point of being able to get a particular kind of effect reliably, right? And I think that general thing, I mean, you think about, we're having this call right now. I think we're in 3 different countries, aren't we? I didn't ask. Eric, where are you?
Texas.
So definitely we're in 3 different countries.
Yeah.
So we're in 3 different countries, right? Spanning across various points in the globe. We're bouncing the shit off satellites. It's going through fiber optic cables, right? All of this comes out of a technological innovation, which was, a little over 100 years ago. Alexander Graham Bell speaks into a piece of, compressive carbon, and like 3 meters away in another room, his butler or whatever picks up the line and he hears, Watson, come here. That was only 100 years ago. Our ability to technically refine things once we poke a hole, right, with science is astounding. We're very good at that. And so, there are certain kinds of questions that I think science can't really get at. I mean, this is Jung's point, essentially speaking about sort of the relationship between the self and God, and how that fits together with agnosticism, right? Which is, at some level, it's just epistemologically impossible to get confirmation or disconfirmation of the existence of God. What experience or evidence could you receive that would actually definitively, you might develop conviction, but like in a philosophical epistemological sense, there's no way to prove or disprove the existence of God. It doesn't matter what happens. The sky could crack open and Beardman could lean out and say, I'm God. And the next day, we'd all be arguing about what happened, right? Even if we agreed on what we saw, we would be disagreeing on the interpretation, and people would be like, it's probably some kind of seismic effect of jittering your temporal lobes, or that could have been a nearby alien, or who the hell knows, right? But Jung's point is a good one, which is, however, it's sort of indisputable when you look in the data that people have encounters with something deep within their own psyche, which by its nature appears using the kind of forms and language, right? The divine grammar. That when we have these encounters with the self, like what smashes in speaks in metaphor, riddle, and strange melded opposites and paradox, and that's how it hits us. Is that ultimately an experience of God? Impossible to tell. But the point is that if you don't have a relationship with that thing, with that aspect in your personality, you're missing out on a profound dimension of human experience. It's part of our shared inheritance. And moreover, if you want to have a relationship with it, you are in some ways backed into speaking the language it chooses to speak, which, shocker, is symbols and rituals and right. Like that's how it speaks, and that's how it's how you can interface, right? In the way that poetry cuts more than prose, if you know what I mean. Like a poem has a concentrated charge to it, and there's using religious language and symbolism that way has that kind of concentrated charge. So you end up doing the same thing, whether you're addressing just some genetic predisposition that you have to have a little twist in your brain that does such and such and such, or whether you are in some sense dealing with the boiling heart of creation. Doesn't matter. You got to deal with it kind of in the same way. So science, I think, can't answer questions like that. Like there are mysteries that, in my opinion, science cannot get at. I sometimes wonder if consciousness is one of those. I mean, I do work in that area, so I have high hopes that that we're making actual progress. But if I'm honest, like the hard problem is a hard problem.
Yeah.
And the problems of consciousness are hard, and there are lots of these things, that science ultimately can't get at. There's a horizon of mystery, But what it's super good at is these like concentrated hole poking exercises, which then open a possibility. And that's what science does. And once it's right, you can't disprove things, right? But you can make the possibility of something real. Like, so you only need one black swan to prove the existence of black swans, right? You need one credible jab with science, and then we can elaborate the hell out of it. And if that jab is something that lets us poke through, I think these these concrete barriers, these filmy things that we have between us and some kind of more authentic relationship with each other, with nature, with being, right? Then if science can just get the hole in there based on studying what religion has already been doing, then everybody else in science can just go at it and pull that thing open. And in 100 years, we've got whatever the transition is to where we are now technologically with telecommunications equivalent is, that's where I place my hope in science, that it's fantastically good at doing that particular thing. And I think some people are scared. Sometimes I'm scared about, the instrumentalization, I guess, of the sacred, and I used to work in that field. That's a whole other story. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of promise. There was something that jumped out about what you had just said, Tim, and how it bounced off what Erick said. And what I thought was, it's interesting. You guys have talked about this, like the issues that people have. And I realized it's like, it's the conflation of abstraction and concreteness in both directions. When you're talking about the concrete boxes, right? And every time you say it, I find the song Little Boxes running through my head. You know that song?
Yeah. Yep.
Little Boxes Made of Ticky Tacky. Yep. Oh, it's good. There's a Def Cab for Cutie version that I quite like. I recommend. So, little boxes, right? And these like nested boxes. And what is that? That's us. What are the boxes? The boxes are abstractions, but they're abstractions that we take to be concrete. Right. And then, Tim, what you were mentioning is sort of the opposite, right? It's this conflation where we take things that are concrete and we treat them abstractly. We treat them highly abstractly. And so we seem to get jammed in both directions, right? And I don't remember where that thought was pointing, but it did occur to me.
Yeah, and the thing that arises in me is that actually touches beautifully on what I see as like the marriage that can happen between science and the sacred is discerning what can be concretized and what is actually made more sacred through concretizing it, which I think is the realm of science. And then what needs to not be concretized, that needs to stay abstractions, that needs to stay symbolic, and that's actually how you get the most, like the reason we concretize is to attempt to get more functionality or usefulness out of it. And that by not concretizing the sacred, you actually get the function that you seek from concretizing it. Like one of the things as a coach that comes up more, like especially for people who are just beginning to use plants to like alter consciousness, is do not concretize the symbols. And people want to concretize the symbols that make them feel huge and godlike and grand.
Yes.
And then anything that comes that is scary, I'll leave that in abstraction. And it comes up in dream interpretation all the time. And that feels like if we can discern between the usefulness of what needs to be concretized and what needs to be left symbolic, I think that that's how we can get the most out of what feels like these two dominant spheres, which is like the essence of science and the essence of the sacred.
Yeah, it's interesting, for sure, with dream interpretation, right? There's always that, and even I had this in analysis. There's always this tendency to hit the facile interpretation, right? The simplest thing, you dream about your aunt and it's like, oh, it's about my aunt. It's like, no, it isn't. No. It's about you. Or it's not. It's transjective, right? So it points both ways, but that's even harder to really wrap your head around, the idea that it's like, yes, it points into the world, but also it's pointing into yourself. And 100%. The genius of the dream maker is that it manages to perfectly clothe one to the other. It's the bon mot, right? Effect where, a really good word in a poem is not accidental, and it's just so, right? And dreams are just so in that Jungian way. It's like, that's a big difference in some ways, right? Between the Jungian and the Freudian. It's like
100%.
Just a pen and a knife aren't just penises. I mean, maybe they are a bit, but if there's a knife in your dream, it's because it's a knife. It's a knife and not something else. And so what's a knife? Why that? It's not accidental. Why a knife? And so, but getting that down, that like fine tuning the level of abstraction and getting it pointing in both directions, it's hard.
100%. It's art.
So hard. Yeah, it's hard.
That can help us with this. And is there a myth that can help sort of place this relationship between the abstraction and the concrete as we've come to use them in this conversation? Because I have them, in some ways I have them locked, but in another sense, I find myself looking for more clarity.
For the one Erick was talking about, which is this, like, as people are doing this work, they often want to concretize the symbols that inflate them, right? They want to turn things into godlike talismans they can clutch onto so they can smash through the rest of their life. Icarus, it's the myth of Icarus. That's the classic inflation myth. So you're trapped in the labyrinth, right? Because your father is the labyrinth maker, because some king's wife slept with a sacred bull. They always go way back, right? They always chain into each other. But the point is, you're stuck in a labyrinth. And your father, of course, is brilliant and a godlike kind of creator. And so he fashions wings. But he warns you, don't fly too high, don't fly too low. It's Goldilocks. Don't fly too high, don't fly too low. We always remember the too high. We never remember the too low, right? We always remember because that's what he did, right? He flies up towards the sun, and in so doing, heats up too much, and he's in the drink. But he equally could have, if he had flown too low, right? He would have picked up too much moisture on the wings. And so this middle path, right? And somehow being able to transition those is sort of central in some way to Icarus. I mean, think about to fly as a bird, you've got muscular action, but you're also like riding up drafts, and there's a dynamic quality to it, to going through the middle. And yeah, for sure, with plant teachers, with mystical experiences generally, certainly with meditative experiences, the drive towards inflation is so powerful, and it's so tricky. It wants to convince you that you are, that
you are the archetype.
Yeah, that you're the new Messiah. Congrats, right? Yeah. And it can be very convincing. The thing I always tell my students is, if you think you've reached enlightenment, spend the weekend with your family.
Yep. Ram Dass. Yep.
Right. Yes, Ram Dass. That's right. Yeah. So, because like nothing lances that faster than having your old horseshit adolescent complexes rage all over the place.
Amen. And I think the beautiful thing about the myth of Icarus is that the other, like, where people default. So it feels like when the psyche hits an obstacle in life, if it doesn't want to actually contend with being transformed by the obstacle, the two things it will tend to do is either inflate or try to depress below it. And Icarus feels like the perfect example. Like, a lot of people will destroy themselves through false stories, so they don't even begin to contend with transformation. And then other people will try to inflate above it, so they, again, do not have to contend with transformation. And, you know, that brings us full circle. I think that that's actually why the hero's journey, when looked at as an archetypical map to guide you to transforming the ego in the presence of what the self calls you to face, seems to be the most useful guide map as, you know, a quote unquote coach that I have found so far in my life.
Yeah, I think you've really got something there. Like, you know, the idea is you're trying to fly this middle ground, and it's like there are rules to some extent. You know, there aren't really, but there sort of are. And right, and that in and of itself is confusing as hell. And so people's responses are they dive too low, and then they say there are rules, and these are the rules, and I know the rules, right? And they do not flex. And I'd rather be certain and wrong than to bother to shake that off. And you know, that way lies all kinds of things, right? I think in some ways, like, you know, dogmatic Dawkins style new atheism is not much different than fundamentalism. Amen. In that sense, right? It's just this like no, and I know, and that is its own form of hubris. And just like, you know, whatever general absurdity. So you know, that's to go low. And if you want to go high, what do? You puff yourself up real far and say, well, luckily rules don't apply to me. I transcend the rules through my very being. And the thing is, they've got something to them, right? But divorced from each other, you know, it's a nightmare. You know, it's a nightmare. So, and then you end up in the drink, no matter what you do. It's not so bad to go in the drink, to be fair. That's the whole bottom half of the hero's journey. Get in the drink. Yeah.
So I'm hearing a lot of the ongoing need to learn how to make boats we can sail in this time. You know, now maybe boats aren't getting off the air there, so it needs to be some sort of hovercraft just to like stick with the Icarus thing.
Oh, boats are going to come back.
Yeah. Well,
sailboats are awesome.
Yeah. It seems. Something I'm increasingly fascinated by is the kind of, as I mentioned earlier, what you might call the sort of archetypes of what enables optimal or at least good generativity in conversation. We might just say like what makes for a good group of friends, even what makes that's actually adapting to an environment, you know, able to build and essentially take care of what needs to be taken care of, as they all become who they are. You know, this notion of the self that calls that you speak to, Erick, I often sense that the process of individuation in Jung, and I haven't read enough to be sure of this, but some sort of concern that I've developed, particularly as well, sort of analyzing or observing the Jordan Peterson phenomenon and how he addresses just that whole journey, ongoing journey, and what that ended up crystallizing in terms of a message and in terms of individual responsibility and self-authorship fundamentally, which is the fourth stage in Kegan's developmental model, the fifth being something beyond self-authoring. I forget the exact name he gives to it. Do you recall? But it's like a trans paradigmatic thing. It's like an interdependency, the recognition of interdependency. So beyond self-authorship, how can we become together what we need to be? So that there's this concept of the lookout that I really like, that a guy called Tyson Yonkaporta speaks about in his book Sand Talk, where basically it's an indigenous concept. I used to something similar came to me after a DMT experience once, to do with the importance of appreciating the beauty around me, but also to push just beyond it appropriately, like just to advance my station, but only after I'd really come to appreciate exactly where I was in some sense. And so the lookout is something like, okay, so what of this domain of complexity, this domain that I'm custodian for, what is mine to be in this kind of caring reciprocal relationship with, and what is someone else's, and how are we all working together to together tend to the ecology, which is supporting us all and enabling us all to sort of individuate in some sense. The one thing is an interdependent processual cycle of becoming or a certain sort of transformation. And this notion of the self in the Jungian sense, often I think when people relate to it, certainly I did when I was first encountering the ideas, I think I saw it as something perhaps a little bit too isolated, interpreting it from the self-authorship point of view, where it was though there was something for me to become in a way that maybe didn't necessarily take into account the need for that to be part of, let's say, a tribe, and to be part of a contributing element to that which was the eternal creation of the context, which actually has to be there in order for me to be who I need to be anyway. And so I'm wondering if it makes sense to extend the notion of the self, or if Jung already incorporates this into a sort of understanding. But how I relate to this kind of, how I relate to this sun in the solar system of the self as this thing which projects its light and sort of calls to me. It's both an ember and an echo in some sense. That acorn-like nature, but also the echo back of its projection of what it can become, is that it's a kind of it's a moving center, like the fabric that in each of us, the ember is it's a collective flame in that sense, and we each are responsible for our appropriate portions of the fabric, and we switch sides and we have different roles and all the rest of it, but we take responsibility for the different sort of niches which together constitute this interdependent ecology. And all of that in some sense is self, from a sense of monism, from a sense of we're all connected, man, this ongoing recreation. And there's something inherently transjective about that. I'm just wondering if there can be a critique made of Jung, and I'm not the one to make it because I can't speak to what the man truly, finally, really said. There's obviously lots of different interpretations, but is there a critique to be made of Jung that in some sense the individual's relationship to the collective unconscious even was altogether perhaps a little bit too individual, and not enough of a truly involved participatory remaking of that very fabric of the collective unconscious, if you can kind of see what I'm trying to gesture at?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so it's always tricky, right? Because Jung is writing over half a century and his ideas are changing. And, you know, when you're sort of trying to teach this material, it's always tricky because people are like, well, he says this here, but he says this here. And it's like, yep, it's true. Those are two different things that he said 25 years apart. So you should get to work on reconciling those things. You know, one of the, yeah, I mean, no, I think you're right in some ways, right? Jung is speaking to some extent, and it's an earlier version of it, but out of the framework of, like, you know, Western individualism. And that kind of like atomized vision of the individual. I mean, you know, individuation, even typically as a term, more often than not triggers people's sense that they're going to become, you know, an individual, right? Like a radical monad, you know, highly unified. And, you know, it's only when you kind of get into the concept that you're pointing out that it's like, it's not that simple. You in fact, you're becoming highly individual. You are shedding yourself of your idea that you are unitive. And then you are undergoing something that, yes, involves integration, but not just integration. It involves integration and dissociation repeatedly between different parts to form a far more complex and dynamic inner community, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think Jung takes it for granted in some sense that there is an outer community because, you know, from 1910 through to 1960, those things were still, if not perfectly intact, more intact than they are now, right? There were still bowling leagues and church picnics and like, right, things, the sorts of things that people used to have, community structures at large. Now, at the same time, one of the things the self pretty notoriously calls people to do is separate themselves from the tribe, right? And to walk into the desert, to go into the cave, to put oneself into the monastery, like sometimes separating oneself out, but it's the same thing. It's integration, dissociation. And, one of the most powerful experiences I had in my life, for sure, as an experience of the self was during my kind of second and quite powerful iboga experience. And I had primed myself for the idea of, I was doing some Kabbalistic work, so I won't get too deep, but I was combining iboga with Kabbalah, and I was planning to ascend to Tiferet, the solar sphere, okay? Wow. And the idea was I would encounter the resurrecting gods, right? These are your gods that come back to life. You'd think, being raised Christian, that the God I might encounter would be, Jesus, or maybe a Mithra or something, but when I actually sort of got to this space, this radiant golden space in the psyche, as it were, I encountered Superman. This surprised me tremendously.
I love it.
It makes much more sense. That would have had a far more basic impact on me, and I could go on about that. But the point is, I encountered Superman, had this dialogue with Superman, and one of the things that came out of that, as things that have come out with some of these other experiences that were in some cases based in altered states that were sort of exogenous in some way, and in some cases fully endogenous, right? Yep. These things that broke through the bottom of the bucket, was that very often what these things did when I connected with this was that, yes, sometimes it would sort of drive me into the wilderness. But a lot of the time, and certainly with this one, with Superman and with some of those experiences, it was like, okay, now it's time to go back to civilization. Like, it's time to rejoin the tribe. Yeah. So, and I think that's something that Iboga and ayahuasca both, and my experience with Iboga more so than ayahuasca. Ayahuasca, when I asked it about my human relationships, was like, no, that doesn't matter. Here are 19 neon jaguar gods. That was my experience. But Iboga was very concerned with ground level human ties, right? And to whatever extent, and I think, it's reasonable to think of those things as legitimate sort of mystical experiences and connections. I think that they have this way of pulling people back to community when that's what's needed. And that it, in some sense, mirrors and reflects, and that's the Jungian idea, your inner community and your outer community.
Right, exactly.
It's all transjective, right? That's why we project onto people, and so,
so I'm going to have to go after this, but the thing that comes up in response to your question is that, so my understanding is that one of Jung's favorite stories at the end of his life was the Rainmaker story. And I think the Rainmaker story perfectly answers this question. And so in brief, the story is his friend is in China, is at a village, and the village is going through a drought. And the Westerner, who sees the world through the Westerner lens, is wondering like what the townspeople or what the village people are going to do about this drought. And the people tell them, don't worry, we're waiting on the Rainmaker. And this Westerner is like, what the hell's a Rainmaker? And this old man eventually comes to the village, and the town or the village people go to him, and they take him to a hut at the edge of the village, and they put him in the hut. And the Westerner watches that he stays in this hut for 3 days. And then at the end of the 3rd day, it starts raining. And the Rainmaker emerges out of the hut, and the Westerner goes up to him and he asks him, what did you do? How did you do this? And the Rainmaker said, I come from a place where the land is in order. And because the land is in order, the land does what it must do. When I came to this place, the land was out of order and I got infected. So I had to go put myself in order. And once I put myself in order, the land came into order and the land did what it had to do. And my understanding of that, this embodies what the individuation process is. And it's that you have to get away in order to come into order with yourself. And then the natural byproduct of being in order in yourself is you bring that order to the environment and it improves the environment. And that it will always bring you back to the community.
Perfect.
Thank you for listening. And if you enjoy these podcasts, please consider sharing them or leaving a review, and perhaps also to consider supporting it on patreon.com/voicecraft. Your support makes a life-changing difference and a life-affirming impact. It will help sustain the podcast, build the network, and make possible more community events and educational resources. Read about member benefits at patreon.com/voicecraft. There are breadcrumbs to follow if you look.